I love dogs. Some of you are cat people, and that's fine, but I prefer dogs. Dogs seem to have a different temperament than cats, don't they? Dogs bond more readily than cats do. They want to be with you and tend to want to socialize with you more. They are more eager to please and more loyal to their human owners. I see the best of human nature in a dog's disposition, but cats are a little different. They seem more aloof, more detached, less likely to want to be with you, more like they don't need you, or maybe even don't want you. When I finished the sermon in the first service, somebody said, "Oh, you don't know cats." Well, that's true, I don't. I've never had a cat for a pet, so I'm maybe wrong, and if you're a cat lover and I've offended you, I'm sorry, but there are a few pictures I found which seem to underscore my understanding of the difference between dogs and cats. This first one is if dogs could text, if you could send a text to your dog from work and how your dog might respond, it might look something like this. "Hey, how are things going?" "Oh, hi, things are great. So much stuff is happening. A bird pecked at the window. I barked at it and chased it off. A man came on our porch with a box. I barked at him and chased him off. I'm protecting the house. Are you proud of me? Are you proud of me? Hello? Are you mad at me?" And that's a dog, right? Always wanting to do the right thing, always wanting a pat on the head, always happy to please. Now, if your cat could text, and you started off the same text with your cat, it might look something like this. "Hey, how are things going?" Read at 1:48 p.m. This is what dogs thought about quarantining during the COVID period. "He loves me so much, he quit his job to be with me." This is what cats thought. I knew that idiot would get fired one day. There's a difference, right? In the attitude, you just seem to kind of read it. Maybe I'm wrong. Here's a dog's reaction if you come home late from work. "You're late? I don't care. I'm just happy you're home." Here's a cat's reaction. "You're late? My dinner is late. I will attack you in your sleep." A dog thinks, "They feed me, take care of me, love me. They must be gods." A cat thinks, "They feed me, take care of me, love me. I must be a god." There's definitely a difference in disposition. Whether I'm reading that correctly or not, I don't know. But I love dogs. I cannot watch those commercials sponsored by the ASPCA. You know the ones, right? You see on TV of dogs who are horribly abused and terribly neglected, and you see that sad look on their face, and you just want to rescue every one of those dogs. I have to switch the channels. I can't stand to watch that. Some dogs do need to be rescued, but I can't rescue every one. We did have a rescue dog once. It had been abused. Someone gave her to us within a few months after we had been married. She was a beautiful 1-year-old Irish setter. We had just moved to our first ministry in a church in Glen Rock, Wyoming. The dog was given to us because her owner had been killed in a gunfight about the time we moved to that town. Local police officers didn't know what to do with her. When they tried to get her out from beneath the trailer that her owner lived in, she growled at them and barked at them and tried to bite them. She had been traumatized by the only humans that she had known, and she didn't want to be with people. A city employee was a member of our church. He asked us to adopt the dog so she wouldn't be euthanized. We did. It was evident that she had been abused. Instead of holding her head high and prancing around, wagging her tail proudly like an Irish setter ought to, she walked in a crouch with her head down and her tail tucked between her legs. She had been beaten so often that she kept a low profile in order to avoid any encounter. She trusted no one. I concluded that if he had treated her that terribly, he probably got what he deserved. I apologize, that certainly sounds cold-hearted. I guess I love dogs more than I love people who abuse them. It took a long time for her to learn that she was loved, by people who were good to her and provided a good home for her and would protect her from harm instead of inflicting it upon her. Once she learned all of that, she wanted to be with us. And she lived with us for 12 years while we were there for the next few years in Wyoming, and after we moved to a ministry in Connecticut. And then when we moved here in December of 1988, she lived for about another year before she passed away in her age. Her story was that of the Hebrew people about 1,500 years before the time of Christ. They had been terribly abused, oppressed by Egyptians for over 4 centuries. They were a nation of slaves who did the bidding of their master and were often beaten for it. They had been abused and oppressed for so long they knew nothing else. They were a defeated people who had no dreams and aspirations of their own, no optimism about a future, until God showed his great love for them and taught them that they were of value, taught them that they were worth being loved, and they found renewed hope in God's presence. We're going to look at a 40-day period during the time of the Exodus, at the very beginning part, really, of the Exodus, the escape that the Israelites made from Egypt on their way to the promised land that God was going to give them. That begins in Exodus 19, verses 1 and 2, and it tells us, setting the stage, on the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. The mountain that's referred to is called Mount Horeb in the Bible. Sometimes it's called Mount Sinai. It's the same mountain. Sometimes it's referred to as the mountain of God, because that's the mountain upon which Moses went to receive the 10 Commandments and all the other moral and civil and ceremonial laws that God gave the Israelite people to live by. So 3 months after they began their exodus, their escape from Egypt, they came to this desert and they found themselves in front of the mountain of God. The Hebrew people had lived their entire lives as slaves. They had not learned how to survive on their own. They had not learned how to defend themselves. In fact, they were accustomed to being assaulted without the right of reprisal. They knew nothing about building a government or establishing an economy or providing for the well-being of their 2 million plus people. They were a downtrodden people who had been beaten into submission. They had no confidence, no security, and no hope. And so God spoke to them the words they needed to hear right there at the base of the mountain of God when he said this to them in verses 3 and 4 of our text. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." In God's words, he teaches us something. He teaches us that it is his desire to be present in the lives of his people. I carried you on eagle's wings, he said. I brought you to myself. He was putting an image in their mind, an image of his providing protection. That being born on eagle's wings thing, that was mentioned a handful of times in the scriptures. It's a phrase used in the Bible to create an image of God lifting us up above our problems, over top of our difficulties, and then taking us safely above it all and delivering us on the other side of them. God makes that promise to all of his people. A promise that he will allow nothing to destroy us. A promise that he will come to our rescue and save us from harm. A promise that his presence will go with us and provide us that salvation. His presence was that for the nation of Israel during the entirety of their exodus. Over and over again, God shielded them from enemies. Over and over again, he led them to safety. Over and over, he provided them food and water. He kept them together. He kept them from being ill. He provided them what they needed. His presence was a powerful force in their lives for good. And so his presence is for us. God, in these words that he spoke to the Israelite people, gives us an indication of his great desire for us all. He wants to be that presence. The presence that provides, and the presence that protects, and the presence that saves. I brought you to myself, he told the Israelite people. And then a couple of verses later, in verse 5, he said, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine. God was saying that he desires his people above all else. 1,500 years later, Jesus spoke about treasured possessions and what they mean to us in our hearts. When he said this in Matthew 6:21, wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. In other words, he is saying, whatever you treasure, you will greatly love. And I wonder, when he spoke those words, was he thinking about the time that God spoke those kinds of thoughts to the Israelites at the base of the mountain of God? I wondered if he remembered God's great love for his people. That relationship of love is for each one of us individually. Going back to Exodus, in the next chapter after our text chapter, Moses delivers verbally the 10 commandments that God had given the Israelite people as the basis of moral law. But before he gave them the 10 commandments, he quoted God as saying this in Exodus 20, verse 2, I am the Lord your God. I've italicized that for a word for a moment, or for a reason. I'll come back to it in a moment. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. That word your in the Hebrew is in the second person singular, which tells us this. God was not saying, I am the Lord, the God over all this nation. And if you are a member of this nation, then I am your God too. I may not know who you are, but if you are an Israelite person, then I am your God too. That wasn't what God was saying. God was saying, I am the Lord your God, Brianna. I am the Lord your God, Howard. I am the Lord your God, Ray. The Lord your God, Dave. The Lord your God, Brenda. I am the Lord of each one of you individually and your personal God. He is that kind of God who loves us on a personal basis. You are God's treasured possession. He wants you to be in his presence. He wants to provide for and protect you. He wants you to experience his saving presence. We need that presence of God. In fact, we flounder when we drift from God's presence, when we neglect practicing the presence of God, when we neglect spending time with him in prayer or reading his heart and his will for us in the scriptures, when we neglect worshiping him. When we neglect those things, we flounder. We struggle more with the problems of our life. Israel floundered soon after God called to them, saying, I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you here to myself. You are my treasured possession. Now, their initial response was not one of floundering. Their initial response was positive. They so loved what they heard from God that they committed themselves to that relationship with him, as we see going back to Exodus 19 in verses 7 and 8. Moses went and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people all responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. And then the next day, when Moses gave them the 10 commandments and rehearsed them, all the thou shalts and all the thou shalt nots, then it tells us that the people repeated that commitment to the Lord, as we see in Exodus 24, verse 3. When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." And then Moses read to them a few days later from the book of the covenant that God had dictated to him to make sure that they understood the laws very carefully. And for a third time, they repeated that commitment. As we see in verse 7 of that chapter, then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." 3 times they committed to that relationship of love with God. And then Moses went back up to the mountain for further laws that God would give him to govern his people. He was there for 40 days. It was 40 days without their spiritual leader. 40 days not being in the presence of God. 40 days of insecurity, wondering, where is the God who has led us out into this wilderness? Did he leave us here to die? 40 days. And they strayed. They broke God's greatest commandment and made a golden calf, saying, "We need a God who will be here with us." And they celebrated that new God in a festival of immorality. It took just 40 days for them to forget their commitment to God. Just 40 days. How foolish of us to think that we can neglect him. Visit church just once a month or less. Not read in our scriptures. Neglect the prayer time that we share with him. That we can neglect all of that and still be spiritually strong, still be right with him, still be ready to endure whatever trials will come to us. We need God's presence. God's presence powerfully inspires us and encourages us and strengthens us when we need it the most. Moses was discouraged after this whole incident with the golden calf. He had been leading those people for over 3 months. For 3 months or more, he had listened to them complain about not having this and not having that. For 3 months, he heard them say, "I want to go back to Egypt." For 3 months, he kept calming their fears. He kept affirming that God was leading them in the right direction, that God was still there, that he was their God and he would protect them, and that he would make them into a great nation. For 3 months, he kept continuing to confirm that to them. And now, after they had made finally this commitment to that relationship with love with God, they went back on it and left God for another. And Moses was discouraged. He felt defeated. He needed spiritual renewal. And you know what? God was discouraged too. In the chapter after the issue, the description of the golden calf worship in Exodus 33, God told Moses he was finished with Israel also. He was discouraged. He said, "I'll provide for them. I'll give them what I promised them. They'll go to the promised land. I'll give them that land as their own. They will be a great nation, but I will not go with them." He would no longer be a presence in their lives. Let's read that. Exodus 33, verses 1 through 3. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and you go up to the land I promised on oath to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked, stubborn people, and I might destroy you on the way." God said, I'll give them everything they want, everything they need. But Moses knew that wasn't enough. He knew that there is far more to life than material things and the blessings that we experience in this world. He knew that he and they as a nation needed more. They needed God's presence. And so in Exodus 33, verse 15, Moses said, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here." He had asked God this previously in verse 13, "If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. And remember that this nation, they are your people." Moses appealed to God's love. And then he requested something for himself because he was so discouraged and felt so defeated. He needed affirmed himself. And he asked God something that no prophet of God had ever asked before. He said, "God, show me the fullness of your glory so that I can be affirmed, so that I can know that you are that great God of power that I think that you are, so that I can know that you can still resurrect this problem." Let's read that in verse 18. Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." Moses was overwhelmed. He could not continue on without God. And neither can we. You have been overwhelmed. Maybe you have felt like Moses did, that it was all on you. It was all on you to hold a relationship together. You're the one who did all the work to maintain that friendship. It's all on your shoulders. It's all on you to hold the family together. It seems to be falling apart. You're doing everything you can to make everybody happy and create a sense of peace in the household and to keep things together. It's all on you. It's all on you at work. You're the one who's carrying the load and you're feeling overwhelmed. Or maybe your questions run deeper than those. Maybe you wonder, how can I raise my children in this increasingly depraved world and protect them from the harm it brings? You can't without God. Maybe you're asking, how can I maintain a reliable moral compass for my life when this culture seems to be lowering its standards of morality continuously? You can't without God. How can I have hope for the future when we live in times of such chaos and uncertainty? You can't without God. We need the security of His presence. We need His protecting power. We need the salvation that Him in our lives only brings. Centuries later, King David felt overwhelmed. He was the primary spiritual leader in Israel, as well as being its king. He struggled with being that person who was carrying the load, and yet he had a faith in God that kept him going back to God's presence. And he wrote this in Psalm 46:1. "God is our refuge and strength, and ever-present help in time of trouble." He knew that because of what he told us was his experience in verse 7. "The Lord Almighty is with us." It was the presence of God, strengthening, lifting, encouraging him. God intends for us to find that same spiritual refreshment in Him. I love the way that God responded to Moses' request. When God said, "I'm done with these people. I'll give them what I promised. I'm a man of my word. Send them on their way, but I'm not going with them." And then Moses pleaded, and Moses prayed, and God responded this way in Exodus 33:14. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Or we might substitute the word refreshment. I will give you spiritual refreshment. That's the promise that Moses needed. And it's the promise that we need too. May his greatest desire be ours. To be filled with admiration and devoted awe of the Almighty God. To realize His great glory and His providing love. to know him for who he really is, so that we too can discover a confidence that refreshes our soul in the midst of a spiritual desert. We cannot find that without him in our lives. May Moses' prayer, therefore, be our prayer. Oh Lord, I want to see your glory. I want to know that the Almighty God is with me, and I will go nowhere without you. Practice the presence of God. Through Jeremiah, God promised us this some 700 years later. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. What he's telling us is he is never far from us. He is not a distant God. Even though sometimes he might be discouraged at our lack of commitment, God never gives up on us. And we can find him if we sincerely are seeking. And I hope that you are. Especially during your times of trial and difficulty, turn to him. Practice the presence of God at all times so that you will be enabled to get through the difficult ones. He gives himself to you as that God, a presence in your life. If you've never experienced the presence of God, maybe it's because you haven't yielded yourself fully to him. He offers that relationship through the acceptance of his Son as your Lord and your Savior. And so on his behalf, we extend that invitation this morning. If you'd like to begin a life of experiencing the presence of God, the indwelling presence of his Holy Spirit living in you that the Scriptures tell us are given at the time of baptism, then we invite you to accept him today. Come forward as we stand and sing our invitation hymn.